rejecting the avoidant, but then they keep explaining, they keep justifying, they keep reopening emotional doors for closure. What they're really doing is asking for validation. And the moment you seek validation from the person you're rejecting, you give up the power of the rejection itself. A self-respecting rejection does not negotiate its worth. It doesn't ask to be understood. It doesn't need the avoidant to agree. It simply states a boundary and lives inside it. That's why it feels so different. That's why it lands so deeply. Because it's not performative. It's final in energy, even if it's gentle in delivery. And here's the paradox that most people don't see coming. When you reject from self-respect, you actually become safer in the avoidance nervous system, not less safe. Why? Because you're no longer chasing, pressuring, or emotionally flooding them. You're regulated. You're solid. You're predictable. And that's the very thing they never realized they were searching for. This doesn't mean the avoidance suddenly runs back immediately. In fact, often the opposite happens at first. They may seem indifferent, detached, unbothered. But avoidants don't process loss in the moment. They process it later when the emotional supply is gone and the internal emptiness starts to echo. And when that happens, they don't remember your arguments. They remember your composure. They don't miss your words. They miss your presence. Rejecting from self-respect also protects you. It prevents bitterness. It prevents rumination. It prevents the slow erosion of your self-worth that happens when you keep trying to prove your value to someone who is emotionally unavailable. You stop outsourcing your identity to their capacity to attach. And that's the real win, regardless of what they do next. Because the long game was never about controlling the avoidant. It was about reclaiming yourself. And when you do that fully, cleanly, without resentment, you step into a position where the outcome no longer defines you. If they come back, it's from a different place. If they don't, you're still standing on solid ground. So remember this, the most powerful rejection is not loud, dramatic, or emotionally charged. It's the quiet decision to choose yourself without asking permission. And once you do that, everything else, how they react, what they realize, whether they return, becomes secondary. Because the moment you reject from self-respect, you stop playing their game and start living your life. Once you understand that rejection is an act of self-respect, the next mistake becomes very clear. And it's one of the most common ways people undo their own power without realizing it. They reject emotionally. They reject while activated. They reject while trying to be understood, validated, or finally seen. And with an avoidant, that approach doesn't just fail, it reinforces the very pattern you're trying to escape. Avoidants are not afraid of intimacy in the way most people think. They're afraid of emotional demand. They're afraid of the moment when closeness turns into pressure, expectation, or the feeling that they're responsible for regulating someone else's emotions. So when you reject them while emotionally charged, crying, venting, listing grievances, or pleading for acknowledgement, you're not creating impact. You're feeding their avoidance. From a psychological standpoint, emotional rejection tells the avoidant this connection is overwhelming. Even if your words say you're leaving, your energy says you're still entangled. You're still asking them to participate emotionally. And that's the trap. The avoidance nervous system doesn't register emotional intensity as importance. It registers it as danger. So instead of feeling lost, they feel relief. This is why so many people walk away from an avoidant feeling confused. They finally said everything. They finally expressed their pain. They finally stood up for themselves. And yet the avoidant didn't react the way they expected. No breakdown, no apology, no sudden clarity, just distance. Sometimes even coldness. But what's really happening is not indifference, it's shutdown. Emotional overwhelm triggers deactivation, not connection. There's also a deeper philosophical layer here. Emotional rejection is still a form of attachment. It says, I need you to see how much this hurts. It keeps the other person at the center of the experience. Calm rejection, on the other hand, removes the avoidant from the emotional equation altogether. It's not about suppressing feelings. It's about not outsourcing them. Think about power for a moment. Not power over someone, but power within yourself. Emotional power comes from regulation, from the ability to feel deeply without being driven by those feelings. When you reject emotionally, you give your nervous system to someone who has already shown you they cannot hold it. When you reject calmly, you keep your nervous system with you. And that's the shift the avoidant feels, even if they can't name it. A calm rejection does something counterintuitive. It creates space instead of pressure. There's no emotional chase, no dramatic final scene, just clarity. And clarity is settling to an avoidant because it removes the ambiguity they use to stay comfortable. When there's no emotional reaction to manage, no feelings to escape from, they're left alone with their own internal state. This is where the long game quietly begins. Emotional rejection gives them an exit ramp. Calm rejection closes the door without slamming it. It leaves a vacuum, and humans are far more affected by emotional vacuums than emotional explosions. Explosions burn hot and fast. Vacuums linger. They create reflection. They invite questions that have nowhere to go. Another important point, rejecting emotionally often comes from the belief that if they could just feel your pain, they would finally change. But avoidants don't change through emotional exposure. They change through absence and contrast. They notice what's gone, not what's expressed. They feel the loss when the emotional environment shifts from chaotic to quiet, and they realize they were part of the reason. This doesn't mean becoming cold or detached in a performative way. It means being honest without being reactive. It means speaking from the part of you that is settled, not from the part that is wounded. You can acknowledge what didn't work without reliving it. You can end something without turning it into a courtroom or a confession booth. And here's the part that protects you the most. When you don't reject emotionally, you don't leave pieces of yourself behind. There's no regret about oversharing, no shame about begging, no replaying the moment in your mind, wishing you'd said less. You walk away clean, grounded, intact. So understand this. Emotional rejection feels powerful in the moment, but it weakens your position in the long run. Calm rejection may feel understated, even anticlimactic, but it's the kind that echoes because it doesn't try to be felt. It simply is. And the truth is this, you stop asking someone to carry your emotions is the moment you take your power back. And power, when it's quiet and steady, is impossible to ignore. Once rejection is rooted in self-respect and delivered without emotional charge, the next distinction becomes critical because this is where most people either reclaim their dignity or quietly give it away again. Rejecting an avoidant the right way is not about disappearing dramatically or cutting someone down. It's about removing access without removing dignity. And those two things are very different. Many people confuse strength with cruelty. They think that to win the rejection, they have to ghost, insult, block, or suddenly become harsh. But that behavior doesn't communicate power. It communicates injury. It says, I'm trying to protect myself by burning the bridge. And while that might feel satisfying in the short term, it keeps you emotionally reactive. And it keeps the avoidant positioned as someone who still controls your emotional state. From a psychological perspective, dignity is regulation. It's the ability to hold your boundary without attacking the other person. When you remove access calmly, you're not trying to punish. You're simply saying this connection is no longer available to you in the way it once was. That clarity lands far more deeply than hostility ever could. Avoidants are used to two extremes, people who chase them emotionally and people who explode and walk away wounded. Both of those responses are familiar. Both fit neatly into their internal model of relationships. What they are not prepared for is someone who disengages without drama and without resentment. That response doesn't give them a script to follow. Removing access means you stop offering emotional availability, reassurance, intimacy, and attention. It means conversations become brief, neutral, and purposeful, or STIO. P altogether. It means you no longer act as their emotional regulator. But dignity means you don't humiliate, threaten, or erase the shared humanity of what existed. You don't rewrite the past to justify the boundary. You simply move forward. This is important because access, not words, is the currency of attachment. Avoidants don't bond through emotional conversations the way anxious types do. They bond through consistent, low-pressure presence. When that presence is quietly withdrawn, the nervous system notices, not immediately, but eventually, and when it does, it creates a kind of psychological dissonance. Why do I feel this absence if I was the one who needed space? Dignity also keeps you from overcorrecting. Some people, in an attempt to appear strong, become performatively indifferent. They broadcast how unbothered they are. They try to prove they've moved on. But that too is a form of seeking validation. True dignity doesn't announce itself. It doesn't need witnesses. It's internal consistency between what you say, what you do, and what you tolerate. There's also a philosophical layer here that matters deeply. When you remove access with dignity, you're practicing non-attachment. Not indifference, but non-attachment. You're not clinging to how the other person sees you. You're not trying to control the narrative. You allow them to have their experience while you remain anchored in yours. That's maturity, and maturity is magnetic. This approach also protects the long game. When you exit with dignity, there's no emotional debris left behind, no cruelty to justify distance, no dramatic scene to replay as proof that leaving was the right choice. Instead, there's a clean break. And clean breaks are uncomfortable because they leave room for reflection. Avoidance often return not because they miss the relationship, but because they miss the emotional environment. The safety of being accepted without demand. When you remove access but keep dignity, you preserve that contrast. If you annihilate the connection with hostility, you remove the possibility of healthy re-engagement. But when you disengage cleanly, the door isn't open, yet the memory isn't poisoned. For you, the benefit is even greater. You don't walk away feeling ashamed of how you handled yourself. You don't carry guilt or regret. You don't feel like you betrayed your own values just to feel strong for a moment. You leave intact. And leaving intact is the foundation of real confidence. So understand this clearly. Power is not about how forcefully you exit. It's about how cleanly you withdraw your energy. Anyone can cut someone off in anger. Very few can step back without contempt. And the person who can do that is the person who has truly reclaimed their center. Remove access. Keep your dignity. Let your absence speak in a language words never could. Once access has been removed with dignity, the most difficult part for most people begins. Not the rejection itself, but what comes after it. This is where silence enters the picture, and this is also where people sabotage the entire process without realizing it. Because silence feels passive, and power feels like action. But with avoidance, silence is not passive at all. It is active restraint, and restraint, psychologically, is one of the most powerful forces there is. Avoidants are conditioned to manage closeness by controlling distance. When things feel uncomfortable, they pull away. When someone chases, explains, or reopens the conversation, it reassures them that distance still works. Silence disrupts that system completely. For the first time, they are not the one creating space. The space exists without their involvement, and that changes everything. From a nervous system perspective, silence removes external regulation. You are no longer soothing them, explaining yourself, or providing emotional context. There is nothing to respond to, nothing to manage, nothing to escape from. And in that absence, the avoidance internal world becomes louder. Thoughts that were previously drowned out by interaction begin to surface. Memories return, questions arise. Not because you forced them, but because there is no longer anything buffering them from themselves. This is why words after rejection are usually counterproductive. People think closure comes from conversation. But closure is not something you give another person. It's something your system reaches when stimulation stops. Silence allows the emotional dust to settle, and when it settles, what remains is truth. Philosophically, silence represents self-trust. It says, I don't need to defend my decision. It's a refusal to argue reality. When you keep talking after you've already drawn a boundary, you're signaling doubt, and doubt invites negotiation. Silence signals certainty, not arrogant certainty, and certainty has weight. It's important to understand that silence is not the same as withdrawal driven by fear. This is not avoidance. This is conscious non-engagement. You're not hiding. You're standing still. You're not disappearing to provoke a reaction. You're simply no longer participating in a dynamic that doesn't serve you. The intention matters because intention shapes energy, and energy is what the avoidant senses long before they process words. Avoidants often interpret emotional engagement as pressure. Silence removes pressure. And here's the paradox. When pressure is removed, desire has room to breathe. Not always immediately, but over time. Desire doesn't grow in noise. It grows in space. That's why silence lingers. It creates a psychological echo. Many people break silence because they feel uncomfortable. They want relief. They want reassurance that they did the right thing. But every time you re-enter emotionally, you reset the avoidance nervous system. You give them something to react to instead of something to feel. Silence forces feeling. There's also a profound self-oriented benefit here. Silence gives you back your mental bandwidth. You stop rehearsing conversations that never happen. You stop imagining how things could be explained better. You stop seeking resolution through someone else's understanding. In silence, you meet yourself again, and that reconnection is what stabilizes you. Avoidants often return after silence, not because they suddenly understand everything, but because the absence changed the emotional landscape. The relationship no longer feels chaotic, it feels missed. And missing something requires awareness. Awareness requires stillness. Silence provides that stillness. This doesn't mean you sit in silence waiting. That would still be attachment. Real silence is full. It's occupied by your life, your growth, your forward motion. It's not emptiness, it's reallocation of energy. And that shift is palpable. When silence is grounded, it doesn't scream, it doesn't threaten, it doesn't demand, it simply exists. And in a world where everyone is explaining, reacting, and performing their emotions, someone who can be silent without collapsing becomes unforgettable. So remember this, words try to control outcomes. Silence allows outcomes to reveal themselves. And when you can hold silence without fear, you demonstrate the one thing avoidants respect on a nervous system level: self-sufficiency. After silence has done its initial work, something important needs to be understood, because this is where impatience quietly destroys everything you've built so far. Avoidants do not process loss the way most people do. They don't feel the impact at the moment of separ. They feel it later when time removes the emotional buffers they relied on. That's why the long game is not about waiting and hope, but about allowing time to do the emotional work they avoided. In the beginning, avoidants often appear unaffected, calm, even relieved. And this is where people panic. They interpret that calm as confirmation that they didn't matter. But psychologically, what's happening is delayed processing. Avoidants suppress attachment needs under stress. Distance feels regulating at first. It restores their sense of control. So early reactions are misleading. You're not seeing truth. You're seeing defense. Time is what dissolves that defense. As days turn into weeks, the absence stops feeling like relief and starts feeling like loss. The nervous system can't stay armored forever without the familiar emotional environment, the predictability of your presence, your understanding, your low demand availability. The internal emptiness becomes harder to ignore, and emptiness forces reflection. This is why chasing early is so damaging. When you reappear too soon, you interrupt the natural processing cycle. You give them relief before awareness has time to form. The long game requires restraint, not to manipulate, but to let reality land. Reality needs time. Emotional insight can't be rushed. Philosophically, the long game is an exercise in non-attachment to outcome. You're no longer acting to produce a specific response. You're acting in alignment with truth and letting consequences unfold. This is difficult because it removes the illusion of control. But it's also where personal power matures. Time also changes the internal narrative. In the relationship, avoidants often focus on what feels restrictive. In absence, the mind reorganizes. They remember what felt safe, what felt easy, what didn't require performance. They recall how you didn't demand vulnerability but offered steadiness. That contrast becomes clearer only when there's distance. And here's the critical shift. Reflection leads to regret only if the exit was clean. If you left with dignity, silence, and self-respect, there's nothing to blame you for. No dramatic ending to justify detachment. No chaos to point at and say, that's why I left. Instead, there's a quiet question that lingers. Why do I miss this if I needed space? For you, the long game is even more transformative. Time breaks emotional dependency. It reveals whether what you felt was love or familiarity. It shows you who you are without constant emotional negotiation. And in that space, self-worth recalibrates. You stop measuring your value through someone else's capacity to attach. It's important to understand that playing the long game doesn't mean waiting in limbo. It means living forward without emotional reach back. It means building a life that is not paused. Growth is not a strategy. It's a consequence of choosing yourself consistently.